Hello, this is Mike Nemeth, Communications Director for the California Apartment Association. I'm here to welcome you to today's webinar, Challenges with Rent Collection Due to the COVID-19 Pandemic. This is the fourth installment of our webinar series devoted to managing the COVID-19 crisis. As anxiety over the pandemic grows, CAA has received a flood of questions about handling some complicated scenarios members are expecting when rent comes due. Things like legal restrictions on collecting rent from residents who've suffered a loss of income related to the pandemic, or some practical steps landlords can take to avoid contracting COVID-19 due to handling rent checks. To help address these issues and more, we have two presenters today, Stephanie Shirky and Whitney Prout, both policy and compliance counsels with the California Apartment Association. Stephanie and Whitney will provide tips on responding to residents who say COVID-19 has left them unable to pay the rent. They'll also go over some resources that rental housing providers can turn to when unpaid rent causes their own economic hardships. And they'll provide recommendations for encouraging residents to use no and low contact payment methods to pay the rent. Before we get started, I have a legal disclaimer to share. CAA strives to provide accurate and timely information to assist its members. This seminar offers general information only and is not intended as legal or medical advice. For legal advice on your specific property, please contact an experienced attorney. For medical advice, please seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider. Information presented in this seminar is subject to change and is protected by copyright. Stay tuned and keep informed with CAA. Now I'd like to turn over the webinar to Stephanie.
Thank you, Mike. As Mike indicated, this webinar was really inspired by questions we received from rental housing providers across the state as this crisis has unfolded over the last few weeks and governments have reacted in various ways. We know many of your residents may be worried about their jobs and their ability to pay their bills, and you may be worried about your ability to pay your staff and your bills and maintain your properties. So the first topic we will address is how to open the lines of communication about this topic with your residents. And when residents indicate they may have difficulty paying the rent for reasons related to the COVID-19 pandemic, we will give you some tips on what to do next. With respect to receiving rent payments, we've also received several questions about what rental housing providers can do to make those payments easy and in line with social distancing guidelines. We'll go over the laws that apply and make some recommendations. And then last but not least, we hope to identify some potential resources for rental housing providers who are either experiencing economic hardships or think they might experience those hardships in the coming weeks and months due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But before we get started, we wanted to make sure you know about CAA's COVID-19 resource page. This page can be found at www.caanet.org/coronavirus. And although we are typically a membership-based organization, we have made this resource available to non-members for free. We hope that it can help you get through this very challenging time. And on the site, you will find a significant amount of material devoted to helping rental housing providers navigate through this pandemic. We will be referring to this website many times throughout this webinar. So now that we've given you a roadmap for this webinar, Whitney, can you tell us and get us started on why it is a good idea to proactively communicate with your tenants as rent deadlines approach?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Stephanie. So as you alluded to earlier, the effects of this pandemic can't be understated. And as we'll cover in more detail, or as we have covered in more detail in two other webinars that are already featured on the CAA COVID-19 resource page that you just mentioned, the concern regarding the spread of this virus has caused both the state of California and several local public health officers to issue stay-at-home orders, also known as shelter-in-place orders or safer-at-home orders. These orders essentially mandate that people stay in their homes and that most businesses cease all activities that can't be accomplished on a remote work basis, subject to certain limitations and exceptions. Those stay-at-home orders have caused businesses throughout the state to close their doors or modify their hours and operations significantly. And we've all seen this, with restaurants in our neighborhoods and things like that. And as a result of those changes, reports indicate that more than 1 million new unemployment claims have been filed in California just since March 13th. So to address this unprecedented crisis, many laws have been proposed at the local, state, and even federal levels to address the crisis, and some of those have been enacted. But overall, I think it's fair to say that both rental property owners and residents are very likely experiencing anxiety and confusion. And so to help eliminate some of that, we've recommended that rental housing providers proactively communicate with their residents about this crisis.
So now you are probably wondering how you should do that or what you should say. Well, we have tried to make it easy for you. If you look at the website, again, the same website that we mentioned earlier, you will find a sample letter that you can send to your residents about COVID-19 and rent payments. This letter acknowledges the current crisis and indicates that landlords are here to help their residents have a safe and secure place to live. It asks residents who are experiencing hardships due to the pandemic to discuss those with you to see if alternative arrangements can be made. And it encourages those who are not currently experiencing a hardship to continue to pay their rent in order to help owners maintain their property and pay their staff.
Yeah, and another thing we should mention, just to follow up on a point you made earlier, Stephanie, is that this letter, along with the other resources available on our COVID-19 resource page, is available for free, even if you're not a CAA member. And we've also gone the extra step to have this letter translated into Spanish. So that is also available on our website. If you have staff that are able to answer questions in Spanish, or if you yourself speak Spanish and communicate with your resident in that language, or if your rental agreement is in Spanish.
Yes, and we've also created a page on our website that's devoted to identifying community resources to help both property owners and tenants weather this storm. So if you look on that page, you'll see that we have identified both state resources and local resources, and we are regularly adding to our list as more resources become available. And we've actually gone the extra step here and created region-specific lists of resident resources that you can actually print off of our website and attach to the resident letter that we just described.
Sure. And before we move on to the next topic, one final overarching note here regarding how to communicate with your residents at this time. Here at CAA, we recognize and acknowledge that the unprecedented nature of this crisis is, well, it's unprecedented. And we believe that our members offer much needed stability by providing safe homes to Californians who are sheltering in place. And to that end, we have called on rental housing providers in this state to support our safe at home guidelines that we've developed and commit to taking certain actions through the end of May of this year of 2020. And you can find information about those safe at home guidelines on our COVID-19 page that we've mentioned a few times. So in addition to communicating with residents proactively and directing them to the available resources, which Stephanie just talked about, our safe at home guidelines are also recommending that rental housing providers freeze rents for that time period, halt evictions, and waive late fees for renters affected by COVID-19, and also offer flexible payment plans for those renters.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of the question here. Let's say that a resident calls you and tells you that they lost their job because their employer had to close their doors under the shelter-in-place orders. And they come and they tell you that they are worried they can't pay the rent that is coming due soon. So what should you do? How should you respond?
Well, that's definitely one of the big questions that we expect rental housing providers will be facing right now. We've already heard from some that are already experiencing that. So let's start with the legal parameters on this question. So first, local laws. It's important to know that as of today, over 80 cities and counties in the state of California have adopted ordinances or directives that protect tenants who are not able to pay rent because of the pandemic or because of the government response to the pandemic, like those shelter in place orders we talked about earlier. So common provisions of these ordinances include requirements or prohibitions on issuing 3-day notices to pay rent or quit if the tenant indicates to their landlord that they've been financially impacted by the crisis. Some other ordinances prohibit you from filing an unlawful detainer action. That is the court action that is used to enforce an eviction if the tenant indicates that they've experienced a financial impact related, again, to the pandemic or the government response to the pandemic. These ordinances vary significantly on their details, such as when the tenant must tell their landlord that they can pay or what kind of documentation they have to provide. But the broad strokes are kind of similar, as you can see on the screen there. Another thing to be aware of is that some of these ordinances also go beyond just non-payment of rent and limit a landlord's ability to terminate a tenancy for other reasons. So for example, they may say that you could not issue what's called a no-fault eviction. So for things such as an owner move-in or to rehabilitate the property.
Thanks, Whitney. And you can actually see a full list of cities and counties that have adopted these limitations, and that can be found on our resources page that we've alluded to many times. And this slide actually shows the piece of that page that's devoted to listing these local limits. And you will also find a link to the local ordinance or order that's in place. And we are actively working on summaries for the cities and counties in the state with the highest populations.
Yeah, and another thing to be aware of is that some of the local governments that have adopted these ordinances and orders have created forms and other materials such as FAQs or forms the tenant can use to notify their landlord that they are requesting a deferral of rent under one of these ordinances to help assist both renters and landlords with compliance. One great example is the city of Sacramento. To the extent those resources have been made available and we're aware of them, we've provided links directly to where you can find those online on our COVID page. So you'll see the city name and then something that says more information available here to access those additional materials. And you can see that here on the screen, that additional information available here. You click that here and it will take you right to that web page.
Okay, so now the other legal parameter that is really important to know is coming from the state level. So after dozens of cities and counties enacted their own eviction moratoria in response to this pandemic, on March 27th, the governor of California issued an executive order. And under this order, if you're actually able to get through the hoops of the local limitations that might apply, and you do file an unlawful detainer action for non-payment of rent, then the resident will actually get an additional 60 days to respond to that action. So that's on top of whatever time that the resident would normally get to respond. And that occurs if two things happen. And that's one, if the resident told you that they couldn't pay rent for COVID-19 related reasons within 7 days of the rent coming due, and if the resident retains documentation supporting that inability to pay. And then the governor's executive order also specifically prohibits the local sheriffs from enforcing unlawful detainer orders for possession for residents that meet both of those requirements.
So taking those legal limitations in mind, we do have some practical tips for you on how to handle this issue. The first goes without saying, we'd think, at this time, but that's to consult with an experienced landlord, tenant, attorney before seeking to evict a tenant for any reason at that time. You really need to know what laws to apply to your property and how to properly comply with those laws for your situation before proceeding, because in this day and age, not only do we have all of these COVID-19 specific laws, but there are all sorts of other long-standing laws that were in place before this, rent control laws, just cause eviction laws, including a state law that took effect on January 1st of 2020 that really has changed the game for many landlords. So it's absolutely worth every penny to consult with an experienced landlord, tenant, attorney before starting an eviction process at this time. The next recommendation we have is to exercise compassion. So aside from any legal obligations you may have, how you handle your residence request regarding deferring rent at this time, paying rent at this time, is a business decision for you to make, keeping in mind your individual financial situation. But we do think it's important to start from a place of compassion if possible. And in line with that call to exercise compassion, our last recommendation is to consider entering in to a payment plan agreement with tenants who indicate they've experienced a financial hardship and may not be able to pay the rent during this time. CA does have a payment plan agreement that is currently available, again, for free on our resource page. And that is a very helpful resource if you are seeking to do this. And for more information on how to use that form, you can look at the third installment in our webinar series that is again available for free on our resource page. And it's entitled COVID-19 Helping Residents Experiencing Financial Hardships.
And if you turned into another one of the webinars that we've posted on our resources page, and that webinar is entitled What Shelter in Place Means for Rental Housing Providers, you probably heard our recommendations for implementing those orders in your business. And one of those recommendations appears on this slide. And that recommendation is to limit the necessity for in-person rent payments and other resident requests to the extent possible by providing contactless methods for making rent payments and service requests. So using rent drop boxes or online portals for making those payments and requests. So I was hoping Whitney could go into this to the extent possible caveat that we have here and where there may be limits on what landlords can do on this topic.
Yeah, of course. So, as lawyers, we're always kind of here to rain on the parade. In a perfect world, we could do everything completely contactless to really help cut down on that risk of transmission. But we do have some legal limitations we need to comply with. And so this is one of the questions we've received from rental housing providers. Can I require my tenants to pay rent online during this time so that, I don't have the paper coming back and forth, I don't have people coming into my leasing office, things like that. But what you need to understand is that your ability to limit the methods of payment you'll accept largely depends on two key factors. So the first is what the law says, right? Always very important. And the second is what your rental agreement says. So talking about the law, under California law, you cannot have electronic payments and or cash payments as the only payment options for tenants. You have to offer at least one other method to pay, such as check or online money, check or money order. So that means you can't mandate your residents to pay online, just like you couldn't mandate them to pay in cash, absent very limited circumstances. And so in addition to those limitations imposed by law, you also need to look at what your rental agreement says, right? A rental agreement is a contract and its terms are binding. And so if your rental agreement allows rent to be paid in specific ways, for example, most rental agreements say that a tenant can pay their rent by submitting a check, you can't then refuse to accept those methods of payment unless you lawfully change the terms of the tenancy. And we'll go over how you can do that in just a few slides.
Okay, so then it sounds like I can't require that my tenants pay rent online, but could I maybe just encourage them to use that method?
Yeah, absolutely. So the key word there used is encourage. You can request that your residents use online portals. You could even offer incentives to encourage them to do that. So for example, you could offer a thank you gift, like a gift card, to those residents who choose to pay online during this pandemic. One word of caution I will say on these is sometimes folks will want to, when they want to incentivize residents to do something, they'll want to set up a raffle. Say, hey, if you pay on this, we'll enter you into a raffle and then we'll pick a winner at a specified date. But something a lot of people don't realize is that that can actually be considered an illegal lottery under a California law many people aren't aware of, that limits the ability to do raffles and other lottery type activities unless they're offered by a qualified nonprofit organization and meet certain legal standards. So avoid raffles unless you've really investigated thoroughly your ability to do it and you're a qualified nonprofit organization.
Okay, so let's go back to an issue that you identified earlier, Whitney. What if I don't currently offer online payments as an option, but I would like to make that an option now and I'm actually able to find someone to do that? Can I do that? And if so, how?
Sure. So in that instance, what you'd need to do is change the terms of your rental agreement. Whether you can change the terms depends on two factors. First, you'll need to consider whether your tenants have an unexpired fixed term lease, like a 1-year lease that they're only a couple months into, or whether they have a month-to-month agreement. So the reason that's important is that unexpired fixed term leases cannot unilaterally be changed by the landlord, but the landlord and tenant can mutually agree to change those terms. So, and then the second thing is consideration of whether a local law allows or limits your ability to change the terms of your agreement. So some local ordinances do limit a landlord's ability to change the terms, and that's typically found in local just cause eviction ordinances. And those are ordinances that limit the landlord's ability to terminate a tenancy except in specified situations, such as where the tenant doesn't pay rent or is creating a nuisance. And on this side, you will see a list of the cities and counties in California that have just cause eviction ordinances. And these are generally applicable just cause eviction ordinances, not ones that are specific to the COVID-19 crisis. An example of how those just cause eviction ordinances can limit your ability to change the terms of the tenancy. You could look at San Jose's just cause eviction ordinance, which says that terms that are added to the rental agreement after the initial agreement is signed, those are only enforceable if they were accepted by the resident after the landlord notified the resident in writing that the resident did not need to accept the change or agree to their being made part of the rental agreement.
All right, so let's assume that I have done my homework and I'm only dealing with month-to-month agreements or tenants that have those agreements. And I know that my local laws don't limit my ability to change the terms of those agreements. So how do I actually go about changing the terms?
So you'll need to provide at least 30 days notice of the change in terms to the tenant. And that's a requirement under state law. And CAA does offer a form that you can use for this purpose. It's form number 152, available on the CAA website. You can see an image of the form on the slide here. And again, remember, 30 days notice is required. So this form can't be used to affect a change in terms for a rent that is due fewer than 30 days after the notice is served.
Okay, so on that note, let's say that I serve the notice of change of terms on March 31st. Then I guess what you're saying is I can't expect my tenants to comply with that change on April 1st, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So if you serve the change of terms on March 31, the notice could be used to make changes in effect on May 1st, so long as you served the notice personally, which is where you actually hand the notice directly to the resident. And if you serve the notice by mail, which is allowed by law, then you actually have to add another 5 days to that notice period. And as with all of our forms, we do offer an instruction sheet that goes into this as well as many more things. So definitely if you're going to use this form or any CAA forms, review those instruction sheets. There's a lot you can learn in there. All right, so now we've covered the legal aspects of rent payment methods, but let's turn to some practical issues. So with state and public health departments ordering people to stay home, use social distancing for essential activities, many are generally concerned about this virus being spread through paper. We've had questions about this, I know, through our landlord helpline, and where we have rental housing providers that are concerned about the virus spreading through envelopes, checks, and money orders that residents might submit for their rent payments. So Stephanie, do you have any recommendations on what rental housing providers can do to protect themselves or maybe their staff that are handling these paper payments?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there's really limited information about the risk of transmission due to touching objects that may have been handled by someone who is infected with COVID-19. According to the CDC, the virus is thought to spread mainly from person to person between people who are in close contact with another, so thus that 6 feet social distancing requirement we've all heard about. And then also it's spread through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs or sneezes. So a CAA recommends following the CDC guidance, and that is to avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands, and to wash your hands often with soap and water for at least 20 seconds after handling rent payments. And also, as we mentioned earlier, you can encourage your residents to use no and low contact methods for paying rent, such as online rent payment portals and physical drop boxes. But again, the key word there is encourage. And if your leasing office is still open, you could also limit the number of people that are in the office at one time and encourage those outside to maintain an appropriate distance from each other in line with the Department of Public Health's gathering guidance, which you see linked on this slide here. And you could even put out paint or tape to mark X's that are at least 6 feet apart to help guide people on where to stand and wait. And then you can also encourage your residents to follow a staggered schedule for when to come to the office or the drop box to pay rent. So for example, you could ask residents that are in odd numbered units to drop their rent during one window of time, and then ask residents that are in even numbered units to come during a different window. And of course, we should note that this would not be an enforceable policy, but it may help to avoid that run on the office if residents cooperate.
Yeah, and it's important to acknowledge that the economic effects of this pandemic are widespread and they will likely impact just about everyone, not only in California, but in our whole country. And rental housing providers are likely to experience an impact as well when their tenants are unable to pay rent. Those providers still have to pay their employees, not to mention property taxes, mortgage payments, insurance premiums, and so on. And they still have the significant expense of maintaining their properties in a safe and habitable condition. So over the next few slides, we'll talk about resources that may be available to help those providers weather this storm.
All right, so as you all have likely heard on the news, the president signed a $2 trillion economic relief package related to COVID-19. That package is also known as the CARES Act, which is short for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. So now I have to note that this act is hundreds of pages long, and we won't be able to cover it in detail in this webinar. But we did want to point out a few parts of it that could prove beneficial to many individuals and businesses. So one element of this package is that it provides for most adults to receive about a $1,200 payment from the IRS. And if you are married and have children under the age of 17, you could actually get more. However, if you have income above a certain level, then you could get less, or you might not get a check at all because the payments do start phasing out for single filers with income above $75,000. And there are some calculators on the internet to help you figure out how much could possibly be coming your way. And the great news here is that if the IRS has your bank account information, it will actually transfer this money to you directly through direct deposit based on your 2019 income tax figures. And as we understand it today, these payments could go out as early as 3 weeks from now. And if you don't have a bank account on file with the IRS, then the check would come in the mail, and of course that could take a bit longer.
Yeah, that's a great summary, Stephanie. Another part of this stimulus package is something called the Paycheck Protection Program. And it kind of sounds like the Witness Protection Program, but it's pretty different. So this is a program that's intended to provide small businesses with 8 weeks of cash flow assistance through federally guaranteed loans. The program would be administered through the U.S. Small Business Administration, which is also charged with coming up for the formal rules for the program. and those rules will be administered by the banks that are part of the program. So we don't know what those rules will be yet, but we do kind of know the overall goal of the program, and that is to offer loans to small businesses with fewer than 500 employees. And those loans would offer generous features, including payment deferrals for up to a year, 4% maximum interest, and the possibility of loan forgiveness if employees are retained. And so, again, we don't have the rules, the regulations that are going to govern this program specifically, but if you're interested in participating, you can call your bank or find SBA approved lenders in your area through the SBA lender match tool, and the website for that tool is shown on this slide. The other option is you could call your local small business development center, again, showing the second link there on the screen. As we understand it, some banks are actually currently offering a pre-application that you can complete even before the rules are finalized, and then the bank can get back to you. And so this Paycheck Protection Program, this is in addition to other SBA loan programs. And one of those is the SBA Disaster Loan Programs, which provides working capital of up to $2 million at a low interest rate to help overcome temporary loss of revenues after a declared disaster. The website for that program you can see on the screen here, and this is definitely not an exhaustive presentation of all the loan programs that are available for businesses during this pandemic. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover all of those, but we did want to highlight some of these big programs that could be helpful to rental housing providers.
Yes, and so let's move on to another item that we expect rental housing providers to be concerned about, and that is their mortgage payments. We have definitely heard that many property owners have serious concerns about their ability to pay their mortgage due to the economic fallout of the pandemic. Homeowners may have lost their income, and rental housing providers may not be able to collect rent. Fortunately, there may be some relief in sight for some owners. So on March 25th, after more than 1,000 rental housing providers took up CAA's particular call to action, the governor of California actually announced that Wells Fargo, US Bank, Citigroup, and JP Morgan Chase, as well as 200 state chartered banks and credit unions, have agreed to offer a 90-day forbearance of mortgage payments for many smaller property owners impacted by COVID-19. And then in addition to that, single family and multifamily borrowers with mortgages backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, they may be eligible for up to 3 months of forbearance as well. But really the overall point that we want to make here is that regardless of the type of your rental property or how many units you have, if your ability to pay the mortgage on your rental property is affected by residents' non-payment of rent related to this pandemic, then CAA strongly recommends reaching out to your lender or mortgage servicer to discuss options that might be available. And then another pain point for many rental housing providers this time of year is taxes. So with respect to income taxes, there is some good news at the state and federal level. The deadline to file and pay federal income taxes was actually extended to July 15th. And the deadline for many California income tax filings was similarly extended. And you can see more information on those extensions through the links that appear on this slide. However, with respect to property taxes, those I'm afraid are still due on April 10th. However, if you cannot make that deadline, your county tax collector does have some ability to waive penalties and interest for late payments in certain circumstances. And such a waiver is generally something that you would seek after you don't meet the filing deadline.
Yeah, and Stephanie, to that point, this is something where some local tax collectors have come out and kind of made statements about what their plan is, while others haven't. So it's really best to check with your local county assessor tax collector, right?
Yes, that's absolutely our recommendation at this time.
All right. Well, one more payment, as rental housing providers, there are lots of bills to keep up with. And we have heard from some of our members that they're concerned about being able to make insurance premium payments. And what we found is that Many insurance carriers are offering assistance to their customers that have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that assistance can include things like waiving late fees and granting grace periods for premium payments. The California Insurance Commissioner has specifically requested that carriers provide at least a 60-day grace period for insureds to pay their premiums. So that could be something where you might be able to get some relief if you're experiencing a loss of rental income or you expect to experience a loss of rental income due to the pandemic. But you definitely don't want to risk your policies being canceled. And so we strongly recommend that you reach out to your carrier to discuss these options rather than just assuming that a grace period or something like that is in effect, so that you don't risk losing any of those policies that you have. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. If you haven't heard it enough, we'll just make one more pitch here for our COVID-19 resource page, where you can find additional information both on the topics discussed in this webinar, as well as many other topics that were not discussed during this webinar. And on this slide, you can just see a really quick table of contents snapshot from our resource page. So you can see there's a variety of issues that are covered on there, and we are constantly updating this page. I think we make changes at least once a day, oftentimes more than that. So even if you checked it out before, go back, keep checking back, because there is new content coming online all the time.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, another resource that you will find on that resource page is additional webinars just like this one. So as we mentioned, this is actually the fourth installment. So if you want more guidance on navigating this crisis in this webinar format, you should also check out our webinar entitled COVID-19 Resident Relations Do's and Don'ts. And then we also have a webinar that's focused on the shelter-in-place orders that I mentioned earlier and what those shelter-in-place orders mean for rental housing providers.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming soon, we're also going to have a really great webinar that's going to be a roundtable discussion with a number of industry insiders, as well as another webinar similar to this one, but that's going to really focus in on those eviction moratoria that we've seen around the state, both from local governments as well as the order issued by the governor. So keep checking back. We're going to keep having more content. And again, these are all being made available for free to the public, even if you're not a CAA member. And then last but not least, if you're looking for general information about the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus from 2019 that causes COVID-19, you can check with the Centers for Disease Control. You can see their website on the screen, as well as the World Health Organization. We also have their URL up on the screen there. The CDC in particular has a lot of great resources, posters, fact sheets, all sorts of great information about hand washing protocols, what works, what doesn't work for virus transmission. So if you haven't looked at their website, do check that out. And I think with that, thank you for your time. And as always, be well.